The second topic for this panel is urban development by Dr. Muna Fawaz. Unfortunately, Dr. Muna, she has apologized, and we will be seeing a recorded video of her topic. So she will not be present with us today, but has kindly recorded her talk. Before proceeding and listening to the recorded talk, let me introduce Dr. Muna Fawaz. Dr. Muna Fawaz is a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut. She's a co-founder of the Beirut Urban Lab at AUB, director of the Social Justice and the City Research Program based at the Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy at AUB, fellow at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies at Harvard University during 2014-2015 academic year and summer of 2017. Dr. Fawaz is the author of over 50 academic articles, books, sections, reports in Arabic, French, and English, revolving around urban history, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land, housing, property, and space, as well as planning, practice, theory, and pedagogy. I think we will be looking now at the video recorded, and then if we see a need to discuss, the co-author, Mrs. Abir Zaatari, will help in answering the questions. Else we can discuss it together.
Hi everyone, and apologies for not being with you in person. I want to start by thanking Alain and the organizers of this conference for first putting together this event and making us think and imagine that it's possible to think through a reform plan for Lebanon in these very difficult moments. But also to bear with me and include me despite the fact that I was unfortunately unable to be with you in person. My presentation today, which is based on the short policy brief that I co-authored with Abir Zaatari from the Beirut Urban Lab, will present a 5-point agenda for inclusive, equitable, and viable cities in Lebanon. I want to begin by noting how important it is to include urbanization and cities as part of a conversation on Lebanon's urban reform. As you probably well know, most of Lebanon's residents actually live in cities. So about 90%, in fact, of the Lebanese, and I'm sharing my screen here, live in Lebanon's 5 biggest cities. This high rate of urbanization increases the challenge of urban livability, of course, but it also provides us at this particular moment with a critical opportunity to sort of imagine economic growth, social development, and innovation in very different way. Indeed, we now know that most of global innovation, global innovation and economic development, in fact, happens in cities across the world. And so it's really imperative for us to articulate this socially responsible and ecologically viable urban strategy that can respond to our overlapping economic, financial, political, ecological challenges at the level of the country. Of course, as we develop a strategy like this and think through the challenges, it is imperative that we begin by recognizing that the reason why we don't have these strategies is far from being technical. And what we absolutely need is a shift in the way in which we've addressed cities over the last 30 years. So for the last 30 years in Lebanon, we have looked at cities as places for sale or real estate. And public policy, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, has really invested in encouraging investment, especially direct foreign investments in land, at any cost, whether it's ecological, social, economic. This has come at the expense of the possibility of the cities to act either as spaces of innovation or even as places where people can live in dignity. This is why the majority of this 90% of the population that lives in these conditions actually lives very poorly, as we all know, struggles with basic necessities like water and electricity. And if that is the case, I really want to start by saying it's not, or at least not only because of a lack of competence, but because putting cities for sale, turning them into sheer or mere commodities, actually serves the interest of a few. And so it is really important, and we wanted to begin by saying that whatever we're proposing is less important in the sense that it's going to rock something we didn't know, than in recognizing that these policies stand in the face of entrenched political, powerful interests that have actually worked against the notion of a common good, which the conception of planning really rests on. Because anytime you introduce city planning in a national or urban context, you are actually asking people to make concessions in the name of a public good. So introducing the reforms, as we will do in a second, to talk about the establishment of urban authorities, to introduce effective planning tools, to recognize city dwellers as partners, invest in the social value of land or in the new Green Deal. The difficulty of doing this is really political. And we wanted to start by noting that this is not and should not be seen as a naive policy paper that imagines that we simply need a recipe. And I'm sure the organizers of the conference are well aware, but given that I'm not here with you to say that, really wanted to emphasize the point that what we're proposing and what would be critical to study is the vested interests that stand in the face of proposing options like this. With this in mind, we can begin to sort of put forward the five-point reform agenda that we have proposed. Of course, an reform urban agenda requires a national development strategy. We design and plan our cities in accordance with an understanding of how they will function or plug into a national development strategy. So whether we choose to work in strengthening the services sectors, tourism, etc., push in smart industries, or think about any other sector of the economy that Lebanon is important in, this kind of development strategy can then be translated into a territorial vision, which ultimately leads to a national urban strategy. So it's very difficult to articulate a national urban strategy without this economic development strategy. But and the 5 points we will propose are nonetheless 5 points that any national development strategy will require. And the first one is, of course, administrative. So the first point we're proposing is the establishment of urban authorities at the level of city regions. As we pointed out, there are 5 large cities that house about 60% of the Lebanese population. About a third of Lebanon's population lives in Greater Beirut. The rest are distributed across the 4 large cities, which we showed here in the first slide. So Zahle, Said, Sur, and Tripoli. All right, so why are we saying larger urban authorities? Well, very simply because problems that cities face across the globe don't materialize themselves at the level of administrative boundaries, but actually at the level of the real urbanization. So when we think of Beirut, and we've chosen here to give you a slide of that's mapped with work I did with colleagues at the Beirut Urban Lab, the trajectories to the left of the delivery drivers who deliver food, the Syrian refugees who deliver food in the Greater Beirut area. And what you see here is a de facto integration of a larger urban territory, which is imagined as multiple municipal authorities that don't coordinate together, that often actually rival each other and block each other's ideas, but which in practice we've known since the 1950s, as evidenced by these recurrent proposals to articulate a greater urban area, that these territories actually really function as one. I mean, just take transport. You have a de facto minivan informal mobility system that actually connects the city, as you can see to the right, and you have a de facto integration of who lives in Beirut and its suburbs, which is evidenced by car counts. So we know that about 70% of the cars that circulate in municipal Beirut actually come from 130 municipalities around it that really constitute this de facto greater urban area. And we've known that it's absolutely impossible to solve the mobility problem, or for that matter, as you can see here, the sewer network problem, without integrating these authorities, because their territories are contiguous, because the populations move seamlessly within them, And that is what has essentially blocked our ability to set in place appropriate urban systems. So overlapping authorities, territorial municipalities have created a situation in which the coordination of problems at the scale of urban areas has become impossible. And where do we start? Well, very simply, we are suggesting that instead of imagining immediately national urban authorities, which would be really difficult, we are proposing that we do sectorally integrated units, for example, transport, and this has been proposed by colleagues as well since the early 1990s, and that we work through these sectoral, for example, an integrated Greater Beirut Transportation Authority that would solve and connect the issue of urban mobility. And this has become even more critical now with the financial crisis and the rising cost of fuels. 3 years ago, I would have told you that we are harming economic development because people are wasting a lot of time in traffic jams. Of course, today, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to afford the cost of fuel are moving much more seamlessly across the city because there's much less traffic, because people can't afford to move. However, that lack of mobility is a serious cause of rising levels of poverty and economic unproductive conditions. So we need to put in place this greater urban authority and facilitate, of course, public transport as a means of integrating the city. We can do the same for other sectors like sewer, like electricity, etc. But the goal would be to put together across sectors urban authorities that would overlap to ultimately form a greater urban area. Now, for these greater urban areas to work, of course, we cannot keep them operating with the kind of planning tools we have. You may be surprised to know that our planning, our Loi de l'Urbanisme dates back to the Civil War. This is from 1983, and it was a mild update of our original law, which was designed in the 1960s. So the planning tools that we continue to use in Lebanon are actually very simple land use plans that are completely outdated at a time where strategic spatial plans are designed for cities to connect public and private sector and harness the strengths of both, where tools like transit-oriented development connect mobility and land uses with housing and facilitate the integration of greater urban areas and their servicing into visionary urban units. And I mean, this is not just France. Of course, this is Europe, but this is also Brazil. This is also sections of India. So this is absolutely something that we need to adopt. These tools do not exist in the way in which we approach planning. Worse, some of the critical tools like participation that can allow you to do participatory budgeting and bring people on board are actually considered or were considered in the 1950s to be illegal and undue influence. So not only we can't adopt them because they don't exist in our laws, but often they are even criminalized by our legal text. So there's an absolute need to renew our urban regulations and to introduce contemporary tools. This should extend to, and I will explain in a second, taxation tools. But for now, just to show you, this is our master plan of Beirut. So it dates back to 1952. It's a simple, basic land use plan that still imagines urbanization as they did in the 1950s in concentric circles where the highest densities are at the center. First, no one does this because you lose all your heritage. This is exactly what happened to Beirut. But second, land use doesn't work without the adequate tools to incentivize, to encourage, to push development. So neither does the modernist outlook of the city still stand. It prioritizes vehicular mobility and so many other issues that are out of date, but it also pushes the city to lose its heritage, not circulate properly, etc. So there is a dire need to renew these tools. And by renewing these tools, we also need to renew the financial tools through which these authorities work. In Lebanon, our financial tools, our taxation tools are still extremely centralized, and that particularly hurts local authorities that are not able to adapt with planning interventions the contemporary tools of value value capture taxation that allow local authorities to design projects, rep the increases in property values that emerge from these projects, and then reinvest them in the city. Just to make it super concrete, if a municipal authority is expanding the city's corniche or introducing a nice pedestrian path that connects to neighborhoods, it is going to increase the value of the properties around it. And today, that profit is fully repped by private developers who, for example, in Beirut, to give you a good example, have sold for the last 30 years the view to the sea as a private property, untaxed, for $1 million for every purchaser. But this is not something that the developers should own. This should go back to the city and be invested in projects directly that city authorities can invest in. Because we don't have these tools, because we continue to centralize planning tools, and I think Karim is here with you and he can answer much better than I can those questions if you have issues about them. But so in any case, so basically, because we don't have these tools, our local authorities have to rely on first, the very few sources of direct income they can raise, like property, like building permit taxation, and second, on going back through the budget, which actually really slows, delays, and reduces transparency of where the money is going because we don't see where it's coming from. Now, relying specifically on building permits for a source of income is really bad because it gives the wrong incentive for local authorities who begin to basically look for encouraging building development at any cost. And this, we saw it in Beirut, led to the city becoming sort of a permanent construction site at the expense of its productivity, etc. So planning tools include adequate contemporary fiscal tools. Both should be reformed, and definitely in this current moment, with the growing tendency to sideline public agencies, including local municipal authorities, it's urgent to recover the substantive role of state agencies. And for that, we need to introduce new planning tools. There are international agencies that can help. Partnerships with academic institutions can help. The Beirut Urban Lab, I speak for myself, has been heavily invested in trying to encourage partnerships and discussions around land issues, as you can see down here, but also with the municipality to improve visibility and expand the role that these authorities can play. This has to be accompanied with legislative changes. And that is really urgent. A third point of reform, okay, so these are some of the initiatives. I had prepared slides. I'll just say these are some of the initiatives through which we've sought from the Urban Lab to create partnerships with the municipality to the left, around land issues with the land registry and other colleagues to the right, always within mind thinking about what are the reforms that we can push, a betterment tax, etc., that can really innovate the tools. The third reform is really one that looks at bringing city dwellers and really all city dwellers as actors in the making of an urban future. Cities today across the world count their population irrespective of whether they are legal or not, whether they are immigrant or not, whether they are voters or not. And the reason we do that is because cities around the world, even if you're illegal, no, you're going to use the water system, the electricity system, you're going to walk on the streets, you're going to produce waste. And if we don't have the proper data, and if we don't recognize this population, we're going to have ungovernable cities. And that's what we have, a city which cannot be governed today in Lebanon. With the growing cash economy, actually, that we're seeing, the size of the informal sector, which was already huge, is going to expand even more. So continuing to render informality invisible, continuing to consider refugees inexistent, continuing to prevent people from voting in the places where they live. More than 70% of Beirut's residents today don't vote in Beirut. All of this creates a sense of apathy. It creates disinterest from the population in participating in the urban future. And consequently, produces, on the one hand, a major hurdle for creating accountability and good governance, and on the other, prevents cities from harnessing the creativity, the investment, the possibilities that residents have. We need to begin by recognizing populations, by forming neighborhood committees. Municipal authorities need to reach out to their populations. Of course, this requires a reform of both the electoral system and modes of local representation, so people vote where they are, but it also requires us to give more visibility through multiple forms of and processes like neighborhood-based committees, like participatory budgeting, like creating town hall meetings regularly to allow residents to be part of the making of the city, irrespective of their legal status. And I want to say in this vein also that rendering informality more visible, creating informal registries for land, for workers, introducing protection for people who rent, even if they rent informally, creating informal registries for workers has been experimented with across the world and created much better conditions for city dwellers. So it'd be really important to invest in that direction if we are to create functional cities. You can see here some of the work of colleagues at the Beirut Urban Lab, again, working in the post-disaster recovery of the Beirut port explosion with the community in Quarantena towards the development of an upgrading plan for the streets and the public networks, which has been now largely implemented. For perhaps the most important economic point, is how we deal with land. And that is really the topic that is the closest to my heart. You see here the plan produced by the Beirut Urban Lab of municipal Beirut. We did not even have a map of municipal Beirut to work with. When we looked at how the city is governed, how specifically its land is addressed, we found out that for the last 30 years, and we have been basically using land as a way to attract foreign capital, to encourage investment. And this has happened with multiple strategies. Some were about channeling money towards the built environment by changing the building law, by changing property law. Others were about lifting protection, like the rent control. Most were about encouraging direct investment by banks, by investors, or by private individuals who began first as subsidized rents for the lower middle income or the middle income, but over time became subsidies to even our current acting prime minister. So these kinds of strategies have incentivized an enormous investment in land as an asset. And you see on this graph here the number of building permits filed in municipal Beirut between 1996 and 2019. And what you see is really, until the last 3 years, a correlation between the filed building permits and the balance of payment. These have translated into an urban fabric where 10% of the fabric was changed in less than a decade, but the new developments are basically largely vacant. So more than a quarter of these apartments, the new apartments, are actually vacant. We can add to those a large stock of housing that's already been purchased and put on hold by developers or investors to be demolished eventually. But a quarter of Lebanon's capital is held as captive investment, as an asset stored like a wealth, right? It's like a safety deposit in the bank. And just like your banks went bankrupt, your property is not only following the way, but it's also losing, making your city, your entire city, lose its value. And so that conception of the role of land in the economy hurts people because people can't find homes. Of course, every building we've demolished had people who were largely protected by rent control, living their livelihoods, buying stuff from the local neighborhood, working, living, going to school in the city. We've pushed them out. We've replaced them by empty towers. We did not have the proper planning tools nor the proper interest to actually invest in real estate, in infrastructure to support these developments. So we've created, basically through this land policy, a city that really is hijacked by private interests. And here we have an enormous number of policies we want to push forward, some towards housing, some towards the protection of the national coast as a way of creating a recreational economy that can be redistributive, like your best example, maybe the French Riviera or the Spanish Riviera, where resorts were actually demolished, but also introducing property taxes, increasing taxes on vacancies. Today, an empty property and an empty apartment is actually untaxed in Lebanon. They're exempted from taxes at a time when cities around the world put exponential taxes on empty apartments to prevent this practice. So there are a lot of strategies. You can find all these publications online, actually, and there are links to them in our paper, but they are critical. I'm aware of time, so I will skip. But there are also strategies we can adopt from the Beirut Urban Labs partners, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, that has really spearheaded from the US fantastic policies for recovering cities in Latin America. Finally, and this may be the topic where I'm the least competent, but I think is the most important, we really need to bring in that Green New Deal, a version of it to our country. And you guys all live it. We know globally that there's a strong shift because of climate change. So this was seen a few years ago as a burden. Today, it's seen as a fantastic opportunity. It reduces costs, it improves services, and it allows people to have greater mobility. Plus, it creates a lot of employment. In cities that have thousands of generators, where air pollution is so bad, and these are produced by colleagues in engineering at AUB, where pollution is so bad that we know it to cause, from figures of the American University of Beirut hospital, very high rates of airborne diseases. We know that our cities have become unviable, and we know that we need to intervene in order to regulate them, and that green energies are the solution. Similarly, we know that the way we've tapped underground water by digging all these white dots are illegal wells in Beirut. We've increased the exploitation of the underground water. I will not mention the waste, right, that we have protested for so many years but never found a solution. There are green, adequate solutions. And the news is the plans, the reliable plans, they've been around in Lebanon for decades. Take this Plan de Déplacement Doux that was funded by the French government in 2015 that allows you to create a pedestrian mobility in Beirut, critical, plus green the city to improve the quality of its air. Think of the plan for renewable energy and numerous others that are already on the table. The point is, we are at a critical moment where we perfectly know that people are ready to go to green energies, that they will create employment, that they will improve the level of services at lower costs, but that what it requires is a change in mindset and perhaps disinvesting from sectors where there are, and I'll finish where I began, very strong invested interests. So in closing, I'll just say that urbanization may be depicted as a challenge, but it is a fantastic opportunity to foster social cohesion, reduce inequalities, and respond to the climate challenge. We've attempted in this short presentation to provide you some of the possible pathways for reform. Hopefully, with a political miracle, they will be set in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fawaz.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for this rich presentation. I would like to ask Mrs. Abir Zaatari, the co-author of this paper, to join the stage and limit the question for 2 or 3 questions. Yes, please. She's not, unfortunately. The co-author. She will try to.
Okay, there is a number 6 that was omitted to put. I don't know if you're aware of it, but we're sitting on a second bomb in Lebanon right now. The port bomb is nothing compared to what can happen next. We have an industrial zone, which is not an industrial zone. We have all the gas tanks, all the oil farm tanks sitting in Daura. It's an HSE issue. One single bullet, everything goes. All the metal will be out, and nobody can take care of that. I'm talking because I'm in the oil industry abroad. When I see this thing, we're sitting on a bomb right here. That should be the first urban to move everything to IPC in Tripoli. That's where you have a tank farm, which is properly done by the Iraqi Petroleum Institute around 50, 60 years ago. That's where all those tanks need to be moved. Gas tanks, we're sitting on a billion TCF. When I say TCF, it's a trillion cubic feet of gas right behind the city mall. Are you aware of that?
Yeah,
no. Let me ask you a question. When you put a gas tank in your home for your gas burner, where do you put it? Inside the house or on the balcony? You put it on the balcony. We're sitting on a half TCF behind the city mall, plus all the fuel tanks of all the oil companies. During the war, half a tank blew up, the dome flew 500 yards and split the building in two. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of
okay.
the
So this should be the first urban thing to do, is to move all those things to either IPC or to Zahrani.
Thank you.
That's where they should be.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for organizing this really insightful conference. So I will try to answer your question. This is actually addressed in the first point of the paper, where it mentions that there is a need for a national urban strategy first, whereby cities become interconnected and at the same time have an autonomous role. So just like what happened, what was being done in Sri Lanka, for example, whereby they allocated a role for each city. They identified 5 major cities, and they allocated a role for each city, whereby one of the cities, for example, is an industrial city with a surrounding tourism or ecotourism for another city. And this is exactly what should happen also in Lebanon. So instead of land use being not identified, the 5 cities that Professor Fawaz has talked about should be allocated with a specific use and a specific role that would come up with a national urban strategy for Lebanon, for it to be productive in the industrial or in the agricultural forms, and at the same time having a main mega center, which would be Beirut. So I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah,
yes,
but it should be moved. It should be moved as part of an urban strategy, whereby a role should be allocated for each city. So this is how it should happen.
I think this is why we're here, to benefit from each other knowledge, and I believe that this is something that should be prioritized. They're not accountable, but this is something that should be at the head of the list of moving this risk and hazard within our city. My second question is much easier than yours, but. Would decentralization help in improving the urban development? And if yes, what would you need to focus on first?
So,
decentralization.
Yeah, we cannot talk about decentralization by itself. So cities should be interconnected. And what Professor Fawaz, what we talked about in the paper, is having a regional authority and administrative area instead of limiting the administration at the level of the municipality. And by redrawing or zoning cities and widening them to their actual territory, not the administrative limits, then you can address issues at the actual scale where it lies. So if we're talking about transportation, we cannot talk about transportation at the regional or the administrative level, but you need to address it at the regional level, and then you would maintain relative autonomy for cities while linking them to other areas at the same time.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if we have any other question, but it's very important for the team to add the recommendation from our colleague to the report that will be generated, and it can be coordinated with Dr. Fawaz. Any other questions?
Yes, of course.
So thank you. We invite you to visit our website, the Citizen Foundation website, to interact with the authors and review and comment the position paper with the aim of enhancing and modifying policies to help in setting a reformation plan and look forward for a better Lebanon.